I'm Alex, speaking first on litigation. With that, my time will begin now. Delbarton negates. Argument 1 is held. Crusoe 22 of Harvard writes that pandemics may be happening more frequently because changes in the way that we interact with our environments. We are seeing pandemics emerge every few years. Unfortunately, a plastics ban would disrupt our readiness for the next pandemic. First, Oaks 22 writes that plastic is used in gloves, tubing, syringes, blood bags, sample tubes, and more. Many plastic medical items are essential, and lives would be lost without them. And Daniele 23 quantifies that plastic equipment reduce transmission rates and maintain vital functions, saving millions of lives. Second, Oaks 21 writes that single-use technologies in vaccine research, manufacture, and operations employs multiple plastic devices to make vaccines timeline from 9 years to just 9 months. And vaccines are crucial in our response to COVID, as Watson 20 writes that vaccinations prevented 14.4 million deaths, a global reduction of 63%. The impact is preventing mass devastation. We need to stay ready, as the Court 23 writes that the next pandemic could claim at least 50 million lives. Argument 2 is food exports. Rinch 23 writes that due to favorable conditions and advanced machinery, the U.S. is the largest exporter of agricultural commodities in the world. Developing nations are driving the increase in demand. Unfortunately, banning plastics would limit our ability to transport food long distances. Oaks 22 writes that without plastic, our food system would quickly unravel. We use packaging to protect food in transit and preserve it to reach shelves. Without plastic, it would be impossible. We need shorter food chains. Independently, a ban would also limit higher crop yields to export. As Anita 23 writes that plastic seed trays, irrigation tubes, and fertilizer bags boost yields up to 60%. Thus, Hoffman 23 reports that a rush pivot could strain our food networks. The impact is food insecurity. Rinch 23 finds that shocks to agricultural production and supply chains can drive prices up and provoke famine and poverty for millions across the globe. Specifically, Caldwell 08 quantifies that in developing countries, increase in food prices will push 100 million people into poverty. Argument 3 is the economy. Sheffy 23 reports because 2023 was better than expectations, 2024 forecasts a soft landing. The country can fight inflation while avoiding economic downturn, which is why 2 Tuesdays ago, Shaw 24 finds from a peak of 9% inflation in 2022, 2024 is likely to witness a drop of inflation to 2.5%. However, a plastic ban would ruin our progress. Taylor 22 confirms that the U.S. has been roiled by shortages of paper bags, and global supply chain issues have made it difficult to acquire reusable bags, which is why empirically in the UK, Messenger 23 reports that alternative packaging costs more than 3 times more. Consequently, Taylor 22 concludes that when stores do manage cost hurdles, consumers feel the impact. Every dollar in additional cost to businesses ultimately shows up as higher prices, which is why in Canada, Gallagher 23 finds that plastic bans resulted in a 30% additional cost to consumers. And overall, Kohei 13 explains that the United States will have to spend an additional 94% to replace existing products. Unfortunately, Bourgeois 23 warns that higher food prices are having stagflationary effects, namely depressing output and spending and raising inflation all around the world. And Bianchi and Melissa 22 write that if people expect inflation will rise, it may lead to trend inflation to drift away from the long-run target chosen, with GDP growth slowing down considerably. Independently, a ban would halt plastic production, which Goldsberry 21 reports would reduce U.S. GDP by $7.1 trillion. This legislation would be absolutely devastating to manufacturing jobs. More than 19 million jobs would be lost. Because of the interconnectedness of U.S. trade, the U.S.'s economic decline would be felt globally, and the world can't afford to slow down post-COVID economic recovery, as the UN in 2020 quantifies that 1 billion people could be living in extreme poverty.
I just have a case. Okay. Thank you. It's supposed to be quick, so I'll try to be quick. I want time start. Josh and I are proud to affirm, resolve, the United States federal government should ban single-use plastics. Single-use plastics have become ubiquitous, not because they're the best, but because of profit-driven plastic companies. The industry endorses failing strategies like recycling to line their pockets while ignoring the environmental reality. Learner 19 finds that the plastic industry profits from polluting the world through a massive industry-led effort to suppress meaningful efforts to reduce plastic waste. The reality, the vast majority of the 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic ever produced, 79% has ended up in landfills. However, unlike what these companies would want you to believe, the problem is entirely avoidable. Alternatives to plastic exist right now and would only improve after a ban. Ali 23 finds that banning plastic presents an opportunity to innovate. Companies develop sustainable alternatives to plastic, leading to the development of new tech and materials. Empirically, in the EU, Hawken 21 finds that a bold single-use plastic ban is driving investment and innovation that defines Europe's low-carbon economy. With that in mind, a single-use plastic ban would have two key benefits. The first is oceans. Plankton are foundational to the Earth's carbon store, but microplastics throw a wrench in the machine. It's urgent. Asher 23 finds that oceans are the largest natural carbon store, crucial to mitigating increases in CO2. Plankton take up carbon and store it deep in the ocean. Exposure to microplastics alter photosynthesis and reduce feeding rates. Studies link microplastic to reduce growth, lifespan, and reproduction. Phytoplankton take up carbon to help photosynthesis integrate carbon into their tissue, and then they're eaten. Deep water is not in contact with the atmosphere. Carbon is stored. Stored carbon, if released, thrusts the planet into a hothouse climate system. We're cleaning up now, but it's not enough to outpace production. Parker 20 finds that the campaign to gain control of plastic is one of the fastest growing environmental causes, yet it hasn't been enough. Rising tonnage of plastic is outpacing the world's ability to keep up. The U.S. is critical. Other countries are already taking action, and the U.S. sets a precedent. Leventhal 22 finds the UN has signed a landmark agreement to reduce plastic pollution. 175 nations endorsed the agreement. If countries stick to their commitment, it could lead to massive reductions in single-use plastic production levels and pollution. In 2024, the committee will finalize the agreement, but there could be plenty of time for countries to back off. If the United States doesn't uphold its end of the bargain, the rest of the world could follow suit. Reject the claim that it's other countries' fault. The pollution comes from United States outsourcing. Yale 20 finds that the U.S. generates the most plastic waste of any country. We outsource it to developing countries, become a top contributor of the ocean plastic crisis. Less than 10% was collected for recycling. Half was shipped overseas to countries with ineffective waste management. The U.S. contributed 2 million tons of plastic. Losing carbon sinks locks in climate change. Ferguson 22 finds the ocean absorbs 50% of emissions, 20 times more than land plants. Plants for stabilizing Earth's climate depend on the ocean to remove carbon. The ocean has an outsized influence. The second benefit is dethroning big oil. Despite clean energy revolution, massive demand for plastic has cemented big oil is here to stay. Bingham 22 finds that we're in the midst of an energy transition, and plastics are the plan B for the fossil fuel industry, as plastics, which are made from fossil fuels, are said to drive nearly half of all oil demand by mid-century. For instance, McDonald 21 finds that Exxon has moved slow in transitioning its businesses to low-carbon energy because the company is betting consumers will keep using plastic long after they stop buying gasoline. Banning single-use plastics eliminates the backup plan. Ambrose 20 finds that removing the plastic pillar holding up the future of the oil industry causes oil demand to collapse. A ban on single-use plastics will wipe millions of barrels of oil from global demand. In that scenario, oil and gas companies transition. Kaiser 23 finds that oil and gas companies are well positioned to become leaders in the energy transition because of their global scale and relationship with stakeholders. Companies can leverage these to offer renewables. A full renewable shift is the solution to climate change. UCS 17 finds increasing renewable energy could lead to a reduction of 81% of emissions. Every degree counts. As Casella 23 finds, every 1,000 tons of carbon can condemn a person to death. Every 0.1 degrees of warming, the world would suffer 100 million deaths. Yeah.
The time will begin. Yeah. So you tell me that in the EU there was innovation. What alternatives exist that are better for the environment?
I'm not sure in the EU specifically, but we say that we've seen development into things like bamboo, into things like mycelium, which are all pretty beneficial.
So is bamboo less costly than plastic, or is it more costly?
I don't think it matters if it's costly or not. We'll probably make the analysis that when products are advertised as reusable, they're also sold for more, right? So obviously the consumer is going to use them as much as possible, which is why my family has had the same grocery bags for the last 17 years, right? You want to get the bang for your buck. But can I have a question? Okay. Let's talk about your argument about healthcare. So name a specific thing that cannot be replaced by a non-single-use plastic alternative.
Blood bags?
Why can't blood bags be made?
Because you can't have cross-contamination, so you can't reuse.
You can't make them out of not a plastic.
Not really.
Why not?
Because then it's not able to be transported on things like ambulances,
it also can't be like singly used to not transmit diseases between different people and host a lot
It's
of
okay, we can still use single-use, non-plastic products.
Like what?
I don't know, like silicone, rubber, things like that.
You could argue that
Other
silicone
preservation
rubber
materials.
doesn't form into the types of materials that are needed for fast transmission of blood to the human body.
Okay, sure, you can push.
On your argument about big oil, right?
Yeah.
So you tell me that half the demand will eventually become plastic, but like, insofar as they cut, like let's say that your argument's true, they cut off the ability for them to switch over to plastic, then wouldn't they just keep what they're doing in the status quo?
No, because they wouldn't be generating enough profit, and our evidence concludes that in that situation, renewables will become their best
Why
source of
not?
revenue. Because we say that oil demand for energy specifically is going down slowly, but we say that oil companies have been slow to jump because they're betting that plastic will allow them to keep generating revenue.
Isn't as the developing world continues to develop and industrialize, won't that increase the amount of oil that's going?
No, because we would say that they can also switch to renewables, and also, even if they have demand, we say that the United States is enough, and we've read specific evidence that there would be modeling to 175 countries, which means that generally there would be.
So that's specific to ocean.
Well, it's about oceans, but it's saying that they want to do plastic reductions as well.
Well, it's talking about like a specific policy within the UN that people are signing on to limit plastic going into the ocean. So I think it's pretty hard to cross-apply.
Well, we would say that
big
it's
oil.
likely that they would do plastic reductions through things like bans.
Why,
Can I
like,
take
what's the cataclysmic, like, togetherness on this? Because like the ocean is like one thing, but like,
I'm
what's
sure
the
that one thing, I'm just telling you that other countries would probably follow the United States. They would probably take action, and the most probable way that they would take action to reduce the amount of waste that's going to the ocean is probably through a plastic ban. But can I have a question?
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
On their observations, stick to the status quo. The NY Times in 2024 finds the emissions are declining, reversing 2 years of warming. But number two, their evidence saying solutions exist now and gets better isn't true for a couple of reasons. A, it is literally from a LinkedIn article that isn't analyzing alternatives or any empirical references. And B, our evidence comes from a meta-analysis of every single alternative and finds the production process increases pollution 86 times and 15 out of 16 alts are worse in the long run. The only one better is steel drums, which isn't scalable. Third, their analysis about innovation isn't true. Europe proves. Alfredson 18 writes that bans usually lead to substitution and reduction rather than innovation. Alternatives already exist, and most bans aim to reduce litter rather than spurring innovation, meaning they can stifle new developments. Prefer this evidence over theirs because their EU empiric talks about, quote, a raft of measures, not just a plastic ban, while ours isolate this policy. On oceans, number one, their Yale evidence is terrible for two reasons. A, it isn't talking about ocean pollution, it's talking about manufacturing. When Fishman 24 finds, posting their evidence by 4 years, that the United States only contributes 0.25% of total plastic pollution. But B, the majority of plastic isn't manufactured or sold in the United States. 31% alone are made in China, which then gets exported and dumped in oceans. Solving for the US doesn't solve for the globe. But secondly, alternatives are proven to be worse. Shin 23 finds that alternatives like glass also fragment into the ocean, which fish then consume and die. Moreover, Say 18 finds that biodegradable alternatives don't break down naturally, require a specific composting facility to break down. So if fish consume these, they also die. But number three, their Asher evidence is also really bad. It concedes alternative dumping in the ocean of things such as steel and rubber are threatening ecosystems and killing phytoplankton right now, which is something the affirmative can't solve for. But number five, the root of plankton die-offs is salt expansion in the water, accounting for almost every single amount of plankton death in the status quo, and it's also things like invasive species, which is what their own evidence concedes. They're not solving for this. But six, Locust Money 18 continues that multiple cleanup initiatives are being launched, solving back for any ocean pollution. Finally, on modeling, other countries don't matter because T23 finds that it's easier for these countries to sign agreements as a facade and not actually make any concrete change. Which is why that's empirically what happened with the Paris Climate Accord, which responds to their analysis about other countries wanting to sign agreements. But B, we warn that other countries do not have the economic capacity to completely phase out plastics. On oil. Number one, their description of oil's demand is flawed. They misconstrued their evidence because what it's saying is banning plastics will slow oil demand growth, not total demand, because they conveniently unhighlighted the word growth. Even if oil majors lose their entire market, they still have their current market, meaning a ban only impacts them as the margins and they won't switch. Second, additionally, their strongest evidence says it will wipe out millions of barrels of demand, but that doesn't matter. As Statista 23 knows, that demand is over 100 million barrels every day. At most affects demand by a couple of percent. But third, the timeline of this argument doesn't doesn't line up. Oil companies couldn't change their model overnight. It would take years to restructure and develop new supply chains, at which point it would be too late. But number 4, even if oil companies do become renewable companies, this doesn't solve for their impact for 2 reasons. A, these renewables would be given out for free. They'll be sold like oil. Insofar as there are hundreds of other renewable companies now and the price is already lower than carbon-based fuels, they don't actually help. But B, there are other roadblocks to renewables besides limited suppliers. Who 23 writes that slow permitting process needed to get renewable projects built, but many in the U.S. only reach 30% of renewable energy goals. 5th, Gollum 20 finds that bans lead to hundreds of millions of additional paper bags, which would decimate forests, as Twig 21 finds that alternative packaging materials require millions more to be cut every day, leading to deforestation. That's devastating because trees are essential since they help to reduce climate change. As Ali 22 reports, it contributes to a reduction of 12% of global emissions. But finally, their impact has already happened because of the reasons they cite. Beth Ham 23 writes that oil companies can retain their dominance via renewables, which is why Shell invested 15% of its expenditures in renewables in addition to investments in carbon capture and hydrogen. Finally, we'd warrant they just sell it to the developing world, insofar as C1 says the majority of plastic is produced in other countries.
I'm talking about our case, and then I will talk about their case. Okay, is anyone not ready? Awesome. At the top of our case, they read New York Times evidence that finds that emissions are down right now. But 1, our argument is scalar. Any decline in emissions is good and saves lives. 2, our evidence says that you need to reduce emissions, i.e. take carbon out of the air, which is what our argument on oceans is doing. They say that our argument is a LinkedIn article, but no, if you look, it's an expert on the field and knows about the policy. They say that it actually increases pollution, but their evidence is just saying that methane is worse, not that alternatives are worse. Moreover, we would argue that reusable things get reused, which means even if 1-to-1 they are worse, people reuse them because there's an economic incentive to do so, which means there's less environmental impact. They say that the only thing that happens is substitution and reduction, but I don't get why this is a good thing. We would say that if there's substitution and reduction in the amount of single-use plastics, that's an automatic good thing, helps the environment. On our argument about oceans, the first thing that they say is that it's only 0.25%, but their evidence is egregious. Our evidence is still taken into account, and finds that even if we're not sending it abroad, we're still going into the ocean. Moreover, they say that China accounts for 31%, but our evidence postdates this and finds that China is already phasing out single-use plastics right now. They say alternatives are worse, but again, they don't go into the ocean, they don't degrade, and we're reusing them multiple times, which means this doesn't matter. They say the biodegradables don't degrade. Again, fantastic. Then they don't hurt the phytoplankton in the first place. They say that there's alternative factors like dumping, etc. But again, it's a scalar impact. Every 0.1 reduction in emissions saves 100 million lives. They say that cleanup is happening right now, but our argument is that production is outpacing cleanup, which is what they have conceded. The only thing that you need is a small reduction in the production that's happening. They say that we don't actually keep up with it, but again, we are just increasing the amount of cleanup that is able to happen. On our argument about oil, the first thing that they say is that we're just slowing demand growth. But obviously these companies have an incentive for growth writ large, which means that we're taking away their growth, they want to grow to renewables. This also responds to their argument that it's only 3 million of the 100 million. That is the growth that they're having, which means if you take that away from them, they want to transition. They say that the timeline takes too long, but the thesis of our case is that you should invest in long term, even if in the short term something is not as great. If you were having centuries of prosperity over a couple of days of inconvenience, you should always prefer that. They say that renewables are too expensive and things like permitting thump this, but again, if we're seeing mass amounts of innovation, which is what I will talk about in their case, then this solved. They say that there's hundreds of millions of dollars that will be lost because of trees, but again, they themselves say that it just leads to reduction, not replacement. Again, they say that they're already happening, but our argument is, yes, they're transitioning to renewables in some capacity, but the thing that is keeping them alive is plastics. They say that we're going to go to other countries, but there's no incentive or evidence right on this question. Our argument is they would rather be in the United States making profit off of renewables. At that point, let's talk about their case. On their argument on health, first, single-use plastics are bad for human health and are the root cause of possible failure. As Table 23 finds, that single-use plastics are poisoning our air and water, increasing diseases, chemical additives pose significant hazards to human health. 2, there's no link, as alt-solve, as Gia 22 finds. The use of synthetic and natural materials as potential substitutes for vaccination tools, biodegradable gums such as cellulose gelatin, have been successfully applied. 3, also are better because they solve for contamination and hazardous waste. Gia 22 finds that due to the poor and unready management system, biohazardous vaccine may end up in the environment, disrupting our ecosystem at an escalating pace. Littered with hazardous biomedical waste, unsustainable vaccine, waste mismanagement, use of disinfectants, natural biodegradable substitutes promotes the missing recovery and treatment of waste. On their argument specifically on food exports, 1, we would say that you can turn this argument as alternatives to actually decrease costs being long term, as Grade 18 finds that the World Economic Forum found that innovative reuse measures actually reduce packaging costs by $8 billion a year. Moreover, our UNF 21 evidence evidence finds that prioritizing reusable products is not only critical for environmental health, but it's also cost effective. Allows containers can save on SUP associated supply and storage expenditure. On their argument on production, first of all, we would say you can turn this because of soil erosion, as RI-14 finds. The plastic is inherently unsustainable. 50 to 70% of the fuel is transported into an inferior sources when blast back is used. Their evidence about 60% increase in yield is only comparing mulch fields to non-mulch fields, which is obviously incorrect. You can obviously replace it with alternatives. On their argument about the economy, first of all, we would say that due to inherent boom and bust, we can expect a great recession almost once every 5 years. But you can turn this argument because of investment. As Justice 23 finds, that investors managing $10 trillion in assets are urging companies to cut their use of plastic packaging. Investors are concerned that companies will face higher costs or lose business opportunity. In the long term, this innovation outweighs. Even if there's a short-term harm, we would say in the long term, it makes our economy more resilient, lowers prices because of competition, and in the future makes the economy and the environment a whole lot better. You should prioritize the long term over a couple of years of bad practices.
Diversifies
Yeah, right now we see oil companies transitioning, so the majority of their profit comes from plastics. They're betting that people will use plastics long after they keep using gasoline.
So if I'm Exxon, would I rather A, stay in my current market, or B, completely transition? It's a yes or no question.
Wait,
Do you
that
think
was
Exxon,
that was an order
would
question.
Exxon prefer to stay in their current market?
Our argument is no
Yeah.
to an okay. Our argument is right now they are staying in their market, i.e. they are expected, they see that people are transitioning to renewables in terms of driving cars, etc. But the one thing that they see people just don't have the will to transition to is plastic.
That wasn't my question.
I think I answered.
It's a very important yes or no. Would Exxon rather stay in their current industry?
Yes, but they're seeing that people
Okay.
right now.
If that is true.
Okay, if I could like elaborate, since you've covered it like 3 times. If Exxon is able to see that people right now are still willing to use plastics, they can remain profitable off of that. Our argument is when you take that from them, then they have to switch.
So one more thing.
Let me get a question.
One
It's
more
been a
thing.
minute 15. It's been a minute.
This is what all the answers all. One more thing.
Can I?
Okay.
It's been like 7. Alright. Okay, last time. Okay, let's talk about oil again. So your last 7th response is that a transition is already happening. And your 4th and 5th response is that there's structural barriers, things like permitting, and just not enough capital that mean that renewables will never transition. So which one is it? Are transitions happening or not?
That's not what the nuanced responses are. The last response is saying that there is transitions that are happening for
Yeah.
institutional people that focus on that transition. The 4th and 5th responses is that for people that want to newly enter the industry,
Wait, didn't they have to newly enter at some point? The
Yeah,
people who are
back when things like
structurally
all the patent filings and that entire system wasn't as complex and hard to get into. What our evidence indicates is
patent warrant? Was it
permitting. Yeah, so permitting.
Okay.
I'll take my question.
Yeah.
Okay. So if it is true that yes, they would rather stay inside of the oil industry, why don't they sell to the developing world?
One, this is like they're just not right now. Like you read zero evidence on the question that it's happening. It was basically over time. It was just like they would rather sell to the developing world. We would say it's probably a double bind. Either A, they have the incentive to do it now, and they aren't because our evidence finds they're still in the U.S., still getting profit from plastics. Or in B, it will just never happen because if you reduce demand, they will just go to renewables, which is what they have the incentive to do right now.
Or the third is they just sell to the developing world.
I mean,
Which,
either
if we
way,
agree-
it massively reduces demand. U.S. consumes
Why?
because we take away plastics, which is a thing that they get money from. So they're obviously going to want to
My
switch to
question
something
is,
else.
why wouldn't the developing world just switch to selling oil to other, or why wouldn't like Exxon switch to selling oil to?
Because there's still less demand. There's a fixed amount of demand in these developing countries if you reduce demand from the U.S.
Neg, Wang, F. For example. Everyone ready? Good. Alright. Time to begin. Now, on our first argument of health, they read 2 terms. First, that's bad for health, but they do no comparative. We would also say that our argument of PPE outweighs insofar as we're saving more people through plastic than will be harmed. But second, they translate that ultra better than ultra contamination. The problem is they cost too much right now, which means you're going to see a massive spike in deaths, especially for rural hospitals that can't afford the healthcare in the first place. With that being said, there's 2 places vote for the negative. The first on food exports. What Rich finds is that the U.S. is critical in maintaining food exports, and a single-use plastic ban would ruin exports because of transportation. What Oaks finds is that plastic is the only material cheap enough to mass ship, and it's also the only material long enough shelf life in order to reach overseas, which is why the impact is food insecurity. What Wrench finds is that shocks to the food supply chain would cause famines for millions, and what Caldwell finds that an increase in food prices will push 100 million people into poverty. They read through responses. First, they tell you that also will decrease costs in the long term. The problem is the long term doesn't matter insofar as 100 million people are going to poverty and millions are dying from famine. But secondly, they try to say it's more cost effective. But the problem is, all take too long in order to put into the supply chain in the first place, which means we see our impacts happening. But also, malts can never be less expensive because they are inherently made of more material, which makes the production costs always higher, meaning that costs will always be higher. But third, they try to tell you that it's turning because of soil erosion. But we would tell you that soil erosion is decreasing by 68% right now, which means that isn't the problem because of plastic use. We're switching to biodegradable alternatives right now, which means that we don't need to solve for oil erosion. Now, why does this argument come first on your ballot? Well, we tell you that insofar as there's a massive shock to the food supply chain, there's going to be a focus shift away from this, and people are going to worry about the economy and food supply instead of the environment. But also, there's a bunch of alternative factors that are causing their impacts, whereas nothing else is causing this food impacts. But then, going to the third argument of the economy. The economy is simple. It justifies that the economy is strong and inflation is decreasing. It testifies that there's supply chain issues with a higher manufacturing cost, which is why empirically in the UK, a ban increased purchasing cost by 3 times. What Gallagher finds is that in Canada, prices will increase 30% when plastics were banned. The impact is worldwide poverty. What we tell you is that Gulf finds that higher prices lead to stagflationary effects across the world, pushing a billion people into poverty. They read two responses. First, they tell you recessions every 5 years, but that's great. But it's not to the same size and scale of our recession, pushing up food and prices by 3 times. But also, what we tell you is if we know what's coming, we should probably try to stop it. But second, they try to tell you that investments and innovation will outweigh, but innovation doesn't happen fast enough, which means that you're seeing our inflation crisis. What we tell you is this is a prerequisite. Insofar as there's a massive shock to the economy, means that they can't invest inside of alternatives right now, meaning that the market will be doomed. We should stick to the status quo. Well, that happens at first. Then, on their argument, on innovation, they can see that 15 out of 16 alternatives are worse. We should stick to the status quo and decrease emissions. But what we tell you is that they always just switch to substitutes instead of producing new alternatives. They try and tell you that no, it's not substitutes. No, our evidence is specific that they switch to paper substitutes, not other alternatives. They don't innovate whatsoever because it's cheaper. Then, on oceans, two things to extend. The first off is that 0.25% is only from the United States. They only said that China is decreasing the amount of demand, but what we tell you is that no, insofar as they're increasing production by 31%, that's not true. But secondly, they can see that alternative dumping causes the same impact regardless, and most die off from salt, and it's not scalable. Then, on their argument of big oil, there's 4 steps to respond. First off, their own evidence says that there's enough of a market to stay in and always survive without plastics, meaning they will always pollute, which is cold conceded. But secondly, when we tell you they can see that they only lose at least 3 million barrels out of 100 million, that's only 3% of the problem. Their impacts don't materialize. But finally, what we would tell you is they can sell oil to the developing world no matter what, which means that their industry stays up. But finally, what we would tell you is that will lead to deforestation. These paper bags will be used in paper, will cut down deforestation, and cut down trees which are sequestering carbon, which means that their impact on climate change will be a lot worse when there's deforestation. Thus, I urge an acknowledgement.
On Halsworth, they've conceded this evidence about methane emissions broadly, which plastic also increases, and they've also conceded the implicit warranting of our argument, which is that alternatives are reused and they cost more. So in the best interest of the consumer to use it multiple times to get bang for their buck. This is not responded to. The next thing they say is that there would just be substitution, but they've conceded that again, these products are more expensive, which means they would just be reused, which means there's no any sort of argument off of this. On plankton, it's the argument where you'll be signing your ballot. What we tell you is that an increase in plastic is increasing plastic is going into the environment, which is bad because microplastics kill plankton, which means that they can sequester carbon, which we say is critical because we say that oceans make up for 50% of carbon capture technology. Our Yale evidence tells you that right now we're doing cleanup, but it's not solving fast enough because there hasn't been a reduction. And also, they've considered global modeling wholly. They've considered that right now there's a treaty to solve for mass amounts of pollution in the whole world, but that if the United States does not sign on to it, then other countries will, which means our link outweighs on scope. They say a couple of things. First of all, they say that we only account for 0.2% of production, but again, we've told you this evidence is horrendous. The United States still contributes a lot and sends more, which is what our Yale evidence concludes. But also, again, insofar as we're accessing a global scope for the conceded argument, that means that we still win this argument. Then they just say that they die from salt. Again, that doesn't mean that our argument isn't scalar. We said that they die a lot from microplastics because it makes it unable for them to avoid carbon. And we tell you that for every 0.1 degree of warming, you save 100 million people from death. Why do you prefer this argument? For a couple of reasons. First of all, it outweighs on the long term. They're just analyzing short-term benefits. But in the long term, climate change causes lots of problems. That's why Josh tells you that you should prefer decades of prosperity over a couple of years of a nuisance. And also, it outweighs on magnitude wholly because 100 million people for every degree of warming. We'll also tell you that outweighs on reversibility because all of their impacts are just about poverty. While we link into death, you can always improve your economic status, but you can't come back from death. Their weighing is really silly. They just say, first of all, that there's going to be a focus trade-off. But we say that doesn't matter. That goes to both sides. And also, we can do multiple things. They don't ever articulate why just because food shortages go down doesn't mean we can't invest. They have also conceded the Jessup evidence, which tells you that it would be the private sector that does it. $10 billion or $1 trillion is waiting to be invested, which means it doesn't actually matter if the government can't solve for it. Their second piece of prereq weighing is also really silly. They just say that in times of recession we can't innovate. And A, we say that there are $10 billion waiting to be innovated. That happens immediately to the after, which means that they don't outweigh on time frame. But also B, we do innovation to get out of recession. We invest in things. So this short circuit doesn't make any sense at all. On oil transition, none of the terms matter. They're not weighted. Okay. On their argument about food exports, we will go for the thing about how alternatives are better in the status quo. We say that alternative packaging can solve for $8 billion a year, which means that food prices go down because it's more affordable. They just say that we don't explain why these would be less expensive because they're reused. It's the exact same warrant that we give you at the top of case. On the economy, they've conceded that because of the boom and bust economy, we will see a shock similar to a recession at some point. Their Lang says that their link is more direct, but insofar as we tell you that lots of alternative factors can cause recession too, they don't have any more of a direct link than we do, which means that this argument is really silly. Vote to solve one.
Not make actual change.
You didn't extend it in summary.
Because you guys dropped it.
It's not
You dropped it.
2018 DX. Defense isn't sticky. That's not a
You-
I
so-
did frontline.
You didn't frontline it.
Yes, I did. Like,
What,
going to
what,
re-explain
yeah,
it,
what was your response?
that the UN is like happening now. Your evidence is just about like compare. Like, this is not 2018 DX. You guys know that you're
You
just
have
saying
to
defense
frontline
in
the
summary.
second problem.
Yeah, obviously.
point
but
out
We
it's
assume that you
pointing
just
out.
dropped the link into modeling because you dropped the response. That's what also happens. Like you guys just like dropped oil in your last link because you conceded defense. What we thought is you
No,
conceded
we
defense on modeling, which
explicitly
means you're not going
conceded.
for the modeling link specifically.
If teams explicitly kick defense, then obviously the argument is
Dude,
conceded.
teams
If you
don't
don't
explicitly kick defense all the time. And every single round, I have not kicked out of help. I've just there haven't been turns, so I've just moved on. The problem is you conceded defense on modeling, which means that you kicked out of modeling because you didn't respond.
I don't
You gotta
remember hearing
respond.
that defense in summary, but that's fine.
It wasn't a summary because you kicked out.
Can we take a question? Okay, why do you have a more direct link into your argument than we do?
It's not about having a direct link. Oh wait, no, it actually is about having a direct link. It's
Okay,
two
that's
things.
fine.
I thought it was like a front line, but this was on the Lang stuff. What we tell you is that there are a bunch of alternative factors that are causing phytoplankton to die, whereas you know specifically that the price increase from a plastic ban would cause.
There's no alternative factors that like influence how the economy is doing.
No, there are alternatives, but we're specifically stopping a recession, a massive recession of a huge size and scale because of the increased
But
cost. of-
our evidence finds that there will be a recession at the same level of the Great Recession every 5 years, which doesn't
Right.
that mean that there are
What we
alternative
would tell you is
factors?
that you're specifically solving for one that would happen in addition to them. No
No,
matter
we're not.
what you have conceded is that because of the specific size and scale of 3 times increased costs, and the fact that we know it's going to happen, that means that we're not actually solving for it. Whereas your argument, there's a bunch of alternative dumping and factors that lead to climate change and pollution that people can't solve for.
Okay, sure, you can have one.
Okay. On your argument about like innovation, right? So, insofar, actually, no, we won't go there. On your argument about oceans, how isn't it scalar?
How?
No, how is it scalar? Like, if
Because we say that-
99% of the phytoplankton is dying for other reasons, how would you?
Wait,
could-
no evidence was read that 99% are from other reasons. Our argument that it's scalar is if more phytoplankton die, more carbon goes into the atmosphere, more emissions, more death.
And we
That's
tell you that for
scalar.
every 0.1 degrees
Yeah.
warming of emissions, you save
But if there's like
100
a billion alternative factors that can lead to 0.001 and you're leading to 0.001 total, then like, okay, so it's mitigatory. It's like vastly mitigatory. You guys aren't impacting out to 0.1% of all.
No, it's
warming.
also significant, and also your argument is specific to like salt water. We say, the warranting in our case is explicit that microplastics prevent phytoplankton from being able to absorb carbon, which is what I read. But,
Can I go with their case, right, in our case? Over here. There's no offensive implication on this whole alternatives debate. You're not voting on it. On phytoplankton, the first thing to extend is a drop turn on their C2. What they have conceded is that the alternative to plastic is paper, which massively increases the rate of deforestation all across the United States. What does this mean? It means even if they are winning their impact scenario about plankton dying, as long as we have trees, they still have the capacity to sequester carbon, which is the prerequisite to their first argument, which means if we win the deforestation debate, we win the round. On their link specifically, I saw your facial expressions. You know they didn't extend modeling. What they conceded is that it's a lot harder, and other countries do not model the U.S. for the Paris Climate Accord, which means not only is the United States 0.25% of the global problem, which has dropped, we are also not the one that is sending it abroad. What they have conceded is China accounts for 31% of total manufacturing of plastic, which means domestic solvency does not equal international solvency. Also, you know that things like salt die-offs cause the vast majority, they're not winning the scalar question. On the way debate. They're only weighing their theory to stay outweigh on the long term, but what they have conceded is our analysis, which finds A, we are linking it to irreversibility insofar as all of our famine scenarios talking about death, and moreover, a short-term spike in food prices to this capacity we talk about has long-term ramifications. If we win the prereq, we win the magnitude weighing. What our argument is that sure, maybe the private companies are ones that are doing something inside of the ocean, but the government is key to contributing to doing things like cleaning up and solving for microplastic right now, which means because of the focus trade-off, when massive price shocks happen, it means that we are no longer able to clean up in their world. Empirically, we haven't been able to walk and chew gum. On food exports, extended. The U.S. is critical in maintaining food exports. The single-use ban with food exports are. We're going for transportation. Oaks finds that plastic is crucial in growing crops as plastic seed rates, irrigation systems. It's the only material that preserves shelf life long enough for it to reach overseas, and it's the only material cheap enough to master food. The impact of food insecurity, widespread that shocks the food supply chain would cause famine for millions. An increase in food prices push 100 million people to poverty. The only thing they said is that alternatives are better. They have cold conceded that it takes a very long time to reorganize supply chains to be able to allow for these alternatives, which leads to the price shocks we talk about in the status quo. Vote for the term, vote for the case. You're negative.
On phytoplankton, comparing the two arguments, and then their case on food. Is anyone not ready? At the end of the day, they extend two responses to our contention. The first thing that they say is that paper is worse, but they have coincidentally conceded our front line, that these things are reused, which means they don't go into the ocean. It means there's no offense implication off of the term. They say that the U.S. only makes up 0.25%, but our argument is that we are exporting them to developing nations, and then they are blamed for the problem, which means the United States is the root cause. At that point, our argument is pretty simple. The United States produces massive amounts of single-use plastics, which our evidence finds harm phytoplankton populations and make it impossible for them to keep in carbon. Our argument is that when they can't keep in carbon, it causes massive amounts of death. Every 0.1 degree increase in warming causes 100 million deaths around the world. The weighing debate is pretty simple. What they have fundamentally conceded is that our argument is long-term. Things like food price shocks are fundamentally short-term, but our argument is that in the long term, you are solving for centuries of prosperity over a couple of years of inconvenience. Moreover, they have conceded that our argument is just more irreversible than theirs. They say that famine links in, but no, just because you're in famine does not mean you're dying. Our argument is that 100 million people directly die from every 0.1 degree increase in warming, which means our argument is fundamentally more important than theirs. Their weighing, again, does not make much sense. They say that there's going to be a focused trade-off, but the same is true for our argument. We can do both things at the same time. Climate change definitely means that we can't solve for their impacts, which means this argument doesn't make a lot of sense. They say that there's alternative factors, but there are also alternative factors to their arguments. You should look to the team that is actually doing comparative weighing. That is us, and which means we should win the round. On their case. The response that they have conceded is the Jessup evidence holding. They have conceded that there are $10 trillion of money waiting for investment. What does this mean on their argument on food? It means that when we see massive amounts of innovation, prices decrease in the long term because of economic competition. Moreover, they have conceded that in the status quo, reusables do save money. Why does this make sense? And the warranting is dropped. When you're able to reuse things, you don't have to purchase them as often, which is why our evidence from the World Economic Forum finds that right now in the status quo, even absent innovation, it saves $8 billion a year, which means there is no food shock. It's terminal defense to their case, and we're winning the long term.